Across thousands of Pacific islands, archaeologists keep finding the same mysterious clues: fragments of decorated pottery, volcanic glass carried across impossible distances, and ancient graves belonging to people born far beyond the horizon. More than 3,000 years ago, a seafaring culture crossed vast stretches of open ocean without maps, compasses, or written navigation, and transformed empty islands into permanent human worlds. But who were these voyagers? And why did their distinctive culture suddenly fade from view? Before we follow their lost routes across the Pacific, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more forgotten history and ancient mysteries. The first clue is small enough to fit in one hand. It lies beneath a skin of tropical soil, mixed with charcoal, shell, broken bone, and the pale dust of coral. At first glance, it is only a fragment of fired clay, no larger than a coin, its edges softened by centuries underground. But across its surface runs a pattern too deliberate to be accidental. Tiny repeated teeth pressed into the wet clay, forming angles, curves, nested triangles, and something that almost resembles a human face. The fragment does not belong to a grand palace, a royal tomb, or a stone city visible from the air. It comes from a shoreline village long erased by storms and vegetation. Yet pieces like it have been found across an enormous stretch of the Pacific, from the islands east of New Guinea to Tonga and Samoa, scattered over distances that once seemed impossible for a prehistoric people to cross. The mystery begins not with a monument, but with repetition. The same style of pottery appears on islands separated by hundreds, sometimes thousands, of kilometers of open sea. The designs vary, but the family resemblance is unmistakable. A broken rim found in New Britain can echo a pattern found in Vanuatu. A vessel fragment from New Caledonia can resemble one recovered in Fiji, on Tonga, where the western Pacific opens toward the blue emptiness of Polynesia. Archaeologists uncover the same distinctive language of stamped clay. The pieces do not simply look similar. They follow shared rules of manufacture and decoration. They suggest that the makers carried not only objects across the ocean, but habits, memories, and a recognizable visual system. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. For much of modern history, the Pacific was imagined from the outside as a world of isolated islands, each cut off from the next by immense distances. On a map, that impression is understandable. The islands appear as tiny dots floating in one of the largest bodies of water on Earth. Some rise as volcanic peaks, others are low coral islands barely higher than the tides. Between them lie channels of deep ocean, where land can disappear below the horizon in every direction. To people accustomed to roads and continental landscapes, the sea seems like a barrier, but the pottery fragments tell a different story. They reveal an ancient ocean that functioned not only as separation, but as a route. The culture associated with these objects is now called Lapita, a name taken from an archaeological site in New Caledonia. The name itself emerged through the imperfect circumstances that often shape archaeology. Local words were recorded, misheard, and transformed during early investigations, until Lapita became attached to the pottery and then to the wider tradition behind it. The people who made the vessels did not call themselves Lapita. No surviving text gives their own name. And no single identity can be assumed across every island where their remains appear. Lapita is a modern label for a pattern in the archaeological record, a set of related objects, settlement choices, food practices, and movements that appear across the Southwest Pacific between roughly the 2nd and 1st millennia before the Common Era. That distinction matters. Archaeologists are not uncovering a lost empire with a known capital, a single ruler, or fixed borders. They are reconstructing connections from debris. Tropical environments are harsh on the past. Wood rots, fiber decays, houses vanish, canoes, sails, baskets, nets, clothing, and carved objects can disappear almost completely. What remains most reliably are pottery, stone, shell, bone, charcoal, and occasionally human remains. From these fragments, researchers attempt to recover the shape of a world. The pottery is the most visible clue because it carries intention on its surface. Many Lapita vessels were decorated using toothed tools pressed repeatedly into damp clay, a method known as dentate stamping. The technique created complex bands of geometric designs around bowls, jars, and open vessels, Some patterns include eyes, noses, or mask-like arrangements that may represent stylized faces. Others form elaborate sequences whose meanings are now lost. They may have expressed ancestry, status, group identity, ritual knowledge, or beauty for its own sake. Scholars still debate how the designs were understood by the people who made and used them. No single explanation fully accounts for their variety or their persistence across such a wide region. Some vessels were too carefully decorated, too fragile, or too elaborate to have been purely practical. They may have appeared during feasts, exchanges, ceremonies, or moments when families displayed their affiliations. A decorated pot could communicate belonging without writing. It could show that a household knew the same techniques or maintained ties to people far beyond the visible horizon. Yet the pottery alone does not prove that one homogeneous population swept eastward unchanged. Similar objects can travel without entire communities moving. Styles can be copied. Marriage, trade, and alliance can spread techniques between groups. The evidence remains incomplete, and the Pacific was never empty of history before Lapita appeared. Islands close to New Guinea had been inhabited for tens of thousands of years. The emergence of Lapita took place when new arrivals, older communities, and maritime networks interacted in ways archaeology is still trying to untangle. The repeated designs are therefore both a solution and a new problem. They prove connection, but not exactly what kind of connection existed in every place. The earliest clearly recognizable Lapita sites appear in the Bismarck Archipelago, northeast of New Guinea, including parts of New Britain, New Ireland, and nearby islands. From there, traces spread eastward into island groups that had never before been permanently settled by humans. At site after site, archaeologists find similar combinations: decorated ceramics, plain pottery, shell ornaments, stone tools, fish bones, and evidence of coastal living. Dates differ. Local adaptations emerge. Some communities use decorated vessels for generations, others simplify or abandon them. But when the sites are placed in chronological order, they suggest movement on a scale without precedent in that part of the world. One of the most surprising features is the speed. Over only a few centuries, communities associated with Lapita material culture appear across a zone spanning several thousand kilometers. This was not random drifting. Accidental voyages may have played a role in individual discoveries, but repeated settlement, transport of crops and animals, and continued contact between islands require planning, even before the details of their navigation are examined. The distribution of pottery points to deliberate voyaging. People crossed open water carrying enough knowledge and supplies to establish new communities, then maintained relationships across distances that would challenge many later sailors. The clues are found in places that once made excellent homes but poor archives. Many Lapita settlements stood near beaches, lagoons, reefs, and passages through coral. Some may have been built partly over water on posts. Such locations gave access to fish, shellfish, turtles, sea routes, and canoe landings. They also exposed villages to erosion, storms, changing shorelines, and shifting land. Over 3,000 years, coastlines moved dramatically. A site that once stood beside a calm lagoon may now lie inland, underwater, or beneath deep sediment. The archaeological map is incomplete not only because researchers have not found every settlement, but because many have been destroyed. This makes each discovery feel accidental. A road cut opens a layer of dark soil. A storm strips sand from a beach. Construction exposes shells and pottery. Villagers notice unusual fragments in a garden. Archaeologists arrive and begin the slow work of measuring, digging, sorting, and dating. Piece by piece, the same ancient signature returns. There is no single object that reveals the whole story. The story emerges from accumulation. Even the gaps matter. Lapita pottery has not been found on every island, and its presence can vary sharply between neighbouring places. Some sites contain dense collections of elaborate vessels. Others contain only plain ceramics or a few fragments. This unevenness may reflect different functions, phases of settlement, or relationships between communities. It may also reflect preservation and the accidents of excavation. What survives in the record suggests a network, but not a uniform one. The Lapita world was likely made of families and local groups whose connections expanded, weakened, and changed over time. The designs themselves seem to hold that tension. They are repetitive, but never entirely identical. They preserve shared principles while allowing local variation. A potter working on one island follows a pattern inherited from elsewhere, yet changes a border, alters a face, or rearranges a sequence. In that small decision, the vast cultural process becomes personal. Someone sits near a shore, shaping clay by hand, pressing a toothed tool into the surface. Perhaps watched by children or relatives, the pot dries, it is fired, it enters a household, later it breaks, its fragments sink into the ground and remain there while languages change, coastlines move, and island societies transform. Centuries pass before another hand lifts the fragment again. By then, the people who made it have no written history that outsiders can read. Their villages are gone, their boats are gone, their names are gone. Yet the repeated marks survive, linking islands that appear isolated on modern maps. They are the first visible outline of a culture whose greatest monument was not a city, but a route across the sea, and once that outline is recognized, the Pacific no longer looks empty. It looks crossed by invisible paths, old enough to have vanished from memory, but still present beneath the sand. Those invisible paths begin in a part of the Pacific where the ocean is crowded with land. West of the great empty reaches, the islands of New Guinea, the Bismarck Archipelago, and the Northern Solomons form a broken bridge of mountains, reefs, and forested coastlines. From many shorelines, another island can be seen in the distance, even where land falls below the horizon. Birds, clouds, floating vegetation, and the direction of swells can hint that something lies beyond. This region is often called Near Oceania, not because it is close in any ordinary sense, but because its islands are close enough to one another that people could move through them in stages. Human beings had lived here for tens of thousands of years before the first Lapita vessels were made. The depth of that older history changes the story. Lapita voyagers did not enter a silent wilderness at the western edge of the Pacific. They appeared in a region already inhabited by communities with long traditions of fishing, plant cultivation, toolmaking, and inter-island travel. The ancestors of these older populations had reached New Guinea and nearby islands during the Ice Age, when sea levels were lower, but major water crossings were still unavoidable. Their presence proves that ocean travel in this region began far earlier than Lapita. What changed during the Lapita period was not the invention of seafaring itself, but its scale, speed, and direction. To the east lay a different geography. Beyond the main Solomon chain, the distances between islands widened. Familiar stepping stones gave way to passages where sailors could spend days without seeing land. This was remote Oceania, a vast zone including Vanuatu, New Caledonia, Fiji, Tonga, Samoa, and eventually the far wider Polynesian world. Before the Lapita expansion, most of these islands appear to have been uninhabited. Their reefs contained fish, their forests held birds, and their volcanic soils could support gardens. But no human fires burned along their beaches. The boundary between near and remote Oceania was not marked by a wall or a sudden line in the sea. It was a threshold of risk. To cross it, voyagers had to leave landscapes where landfalls were relatively frequent and enter waters where errors became far more dangerous. A canoe blown off the course might not find another island for hundreds of kilometers. Fresh water could run low, food could spoil, storms could separate boats traveling together. The sea itself offered no fixed road. And yet the archaeological record shows that people crossed this threshold repeatedly. The world they left behind was humid, volcanic, and crowded with ecological variety. New Guinea and the Bismarck supported dense rainforests, high mountains, mangrove swamps, coral reefs, and river valleys. Communities lived by combinations of gardening, fishing, hunting, and collecting wild foods. Taro, yams, bananas, and other useful plants had deep histories in the region. Obsidian from volcanic sources moved between islands over remarkable distances, showing that exchange networks existed long before Lapita pottery appeared. The sea already carried stone, shell, food, stories, and people. Against this older background, the sudden spread of a new ceramic style becomes more complicated. Some elements associated with Lapita seem to have roots farther west, in island Southeast Asia and the Austronesian-speaking world. Other elements reflect the long-established traditions of Near Oceania. The culture that emerges in the Bismarck archipelago therefore looks less like a sealed package arriving from one homeland and more like a new combination formed through contact. Incoming seafarers brought languages, technologies, crops, animals, and social practices. Local communities contributed knowledge of reefs, forests, weather, plants, and island survival. Over generations, these influences blended unevenly. Scholars still debate how quickly this interaction occurred and how many people were involved. Pottery can identify a tradition, but it cannot reveal every marriage, alliance, or conflict. Ancient DNA now offers additional clues, yet even genetic evidence captures only those individuals whose remains survive and can be studied. No single explanation fully accounts for the mixture visible across the region. What is clear is that Lapita culture formed in a frontier of human contact before it became the culture of an expanding frontier farther east. The people standing on those western shores may not have imagined the Pacific as divided into near and remote Oceania. These are modern categories. To them, the sea was known through experience which channels were rough, where currents turned, when certain birds flew, where obsidian could be obtained, and which communities welcomed visitors. Knowledge existed as routes rather than maps. A distant island was not an abstract dot, but a place connected to particular winds, stars, kin, dangers, and obligations. Still, the eastern horizon remained different. Beyond the last familiar islands lay spaces that could not be crossed by simply following a visible coastline. Someone had to depart without certainty that land waited ahead. Exploration may have begun with short probing voyages, crews sailing outward and returning after reading winds and currents. Drifting birds or unusual cloud formations may have suggested land. Floating branches, seeds, or pumice could offer clues. Accidental discovery was possible, but permanent settlement required more than chance. People had to remember the route, return with others, and carry enough of a living world to survive. That living world included plants for gardens, tools for clearing land, containers for water, and probably domestic animals. It also included social knowledge how to divide labour, preserve food, resolve disputes, and maintain contact with communities left behind. An island could be fertile and still become a death trap if settlers arrived in the wrong season or without suitable crops. The first months would have demanded careful attention to unfamiliar soils, reefs, rainfall, and disease. Some attempts may have failed completely, leaving no trace that has yet been recognised. The successful voyages changed the map of human habitation. Islands that had evolved for millions of years without people suddenly became homes. Forests were cleared, gardens appeared, birds unused to human hunters became prey. Shellfish were gathered from reefs that had never experienced sustained harvesting. Canoes began moving between newly settled shores, turning remote islands into points within an expanding network. The decorated pottery beneath the sand is therefore evidence of more than cultural similarity. It marks the moment when one human world reached the edge of another, the ancient inhabited islands of the west meeting the unpeopled archipelagos of the east. Before the crossing, the open ocean was a limit. After it, the same water became a corridor. The change required no empire, no written orders, and no single heroic expedition. It happened through generations of voyagers carrying families, plants, animals, and memories into a horizon that had never before contained a human destination. The culture that would leave its marks across the Pacific does not appear fully formed in a single moment. It takes shape amid movement, contact, and adaptation in the Bismarck archipelago, where newcomers entering from the west encounter communities whose roots reach deep into the Pleistocene. The result is not a simple replacement of one people by another. It is a changing coastal world in which languages, objects, foods, technologies, and family lines begin to overlap. The incoming groups are generally associated with the spread of Austronesian languages, one of the largest language families in human history. Their distant origins lie somewhere to the north and west, with earlier stages of the expansion passing through Taiwan and the Philippines before reaching island Southeast Asia. By the time Austronesian-speaking voyagers enter the Western Pacific, they carry traditions shaped by generations of island travel, pottery, polished stone tools, domestic animals, cultivated plants, and sophisticated canoe technologies travel with them. although not every community possesses the same combination. Their arrival in the Bismarcks does not occur in an empty landscape. Indigenous communities already know the seasonal rhythms of these islands. They understand which reefs are dangerous, where fresh water persists during dry periods, and which plants thrive in volcanic soils. They have their own fishing techniques, exchange routes, and social histories. Obsidian from New Britain has already moved across the sea for thousands of years, carried through networks older than the Lapita tradition itself. The newcomers enter a maritime world that is ancient, experienced, and far from isolated. The archaeological record suggests that something new emerges from these encounters. Settlements associated with early Lapita material culture appear near coastlines, often in locations that offer protected anchorages and access to reefs. Their pottery shows links to traditions farther west, yet its elaborate dentate decoration develops distinctive forms within the Bismarcks. Shell ornaments combine local materials with shared styles. Stone and obsidian continue to circulate between islands. Food remains reveal a mixed economy drawing on both introduced resources and knowledge of native environments. This combination may explain why the Lapita expansion becomes so effective. The voyagers do not carry only a fixed package of customs from one homeland. They absorb techniques and information from people who have lived in near Oceania for countless generations. Knowledge moves in both directions. Local sailors may join expeditions. Families form across cultural boundaries. Children grow up speaking languages influenced by several communities. Craftspeople adopt unfamiliar designs while preserving older methods. The culture forms because people are moving, meeting, and changing. Scholars still debate the balance between migration and local adoption. Some archaeological models once imagined a rapid wave of colonists moving eastward with little interaction. Others emphasized gradual exchange and cultural blending. Ancient DNA has added a more complicated picture, showing that early settlers in some parts of remote Oceania carried substantial ancestry connected to East Asian and Austronesian-speaking populations, while later generations often show increasing mixture with Papuan-related groups. Yet genetics cannot reveal exactly when individuals changed languages, learned pottery styles, or identified with particular communities. Human identity does not follow a single genetic line. The first Lapita communities were probably diverse even before the Great Eastward Movement began. Some members may have descended largely from recent arrivals. Others may have belonged to long-established island populations. Many were likely connected through marriage, adoption, exchange, and obligation. What united them may not have been a rigid ethnic identity, but participation in a shared social system. They used recognizable objects, maintained long-distance relationships, and occupied coastal settlements linked by canoe travel. Pottery becomes especially important in this mobile world. Clay vessels are heavy and fragile compared with baskets or wooden containers, making them inconvenient objects for long voyages. Their continued production therefore suggests that they carried social value beyond simple utility. A decorated vessel may have marked a household's place within a wider network. It may have been used during feasts where alliances were renewed, marriages arranged, or visitors welcomed. Certain designs may have belonged to particular lineages or ceremonial roles, although the evidence remains incomplete. The act of making such pottery requires knowledge passed between people. Clay must be selected and prepared. Temper is added to prevent cracking. Walls are shaped with controlled pressure. Decorative tools are cut with tiny teeth and applied before the surface dries. Firing must be carefully managed without modern kilns. A failed vessel represents lost time and valuable material. The complexity of the designs implies training, memory, and patience. The same is true of shell ornaments. Bracelets, rings, pendants, and other objects were shaped from marine shell through cutting, grinding, and polishing. Some travelled far from their source. A shell taken from one reef could become an ornament worn on another island hundreds of kilometres away. Such objects linked bodies to places. They made distant relationships visible, and may have carried histories that cannot be recovered from their physical form alone. Every exchange strengthened the roots that would later support colonization. A canoe returning with obsidian also returned with news. A marriage between communities created obligations that could provide food, shelter, or crew members. A decorated pot given during a gathering might become a model copied elsewhere. Through these repeated contacts, the Bismarck archipelago became not merely the birthplace of a pottery style, but a training ground for a new kind of connected society. There was probably tension as well as cooperation. New animals could damage gardens. Competing groups might dispute fishing grounds or access to valuable stone. Diseases may have moved with travellers. Newcomers could become rivals, allies, or both. Archaeology rarely preserves such encounters clearly unless they leave traces of violence, and early Lapita sites do not tell a simple story of conquest. What survives instead is evidence of cultural fusion strong enough to produce something durable. That durability lies in flexibility. Lapita culture could be recognized across great distances because it maintained shared practices, but it could spread because those practices were not entirely fixed. Communities adjusted to different islands, adopted local resources, and incorporated new people. The culture remained connected while constantly changing at its edges. By the time voyagers began pushing beyond the familiar islands of near Oceania, they carried more than pottery and plants. They carried a social system created through generations of encounter. It was a culture already accustomed to movement, already shaped by mixed origins, and already held together by relationships across water. That experience would become as important as any sail or canoe when the familiar islands finally disappeared behind them. When the familiar islands disappear behind a canoe, survival depends on things that leave almost no trace in the ground. Wood decays, fibre ropes vanish, sails rot. The vessels that carried Lapita voyagers into remote Oceania have not survived, and no written description records their exact form. Archaeologists must reconstruct them indirectly from later Pacific traditions, linguistic evidence, experimental voyages, and the distances between the earlier settlements. The evidence remains incomplete, but one conclusion is difficult to avoid: these were not crude rafts wandering helplessly with the currents. They were purposeful craft built by people who understood how to move families and supplies across open water. The most likely vessels were large outrigger canoes or double-hulled canoes, perhaps using sails woven from plant fibres. Both designs offered stability on ocean swells. An outrigger balanced a narrow main hull with a smaller float held away from it by wooden booms. A double canoe joined two hulls beneath a raised platform, creating space for passengers, cargo, water containers, animals, tools, and planting materials. Exact configurations probably varied between communities and changed over time. What survives in later Pacific boat-building traditions suggests that ancient sailors possessed many possible solutions rather than one standardized vessel. Building even a moderate-sized ocean canoe demanded cooperation. Trees had to be selected for length, strength, and shape. Stone adzes cut and hollowed the timber through weeks or months of work. Separate pieces could be joined with lashings rather than iron nails, allowing the vessel to flex with the sea instead of breaking against it. Seams were sealed with plant material, resin, or other compounds available locally. Sails had to be woven, steering paddles shaped, and replacement cordage prepared. A community investing so much labour in a canoe was not constructing a disposable object. The vessel represented accumulated knowledge and a major social commitment. No single boat builder could master every stage alone. Some people understood timber, others knew cordage, sail weaving, or the balance of hulls. Experienced sailors could judge whether a finished canoe behaved safely under load. The construction process tied many households to the voyage before anyone left shore. Those who stayed behind may have contributed food, tools, or labour in return for future access to new land, valuable materials, or kinship connections. Long-distance expansion was therefore not merely the decision of adventurous individuals, it was supported by communities willing to risk resources on uncertain horizons. Navigation depended on memory rather than instruments. Lapita sailors possessed no compass, chart, or mechanical clock. Yet the ocean offered a field of signs to anyone trained to read it. The rising and setting points of stars provided directional references. The sun indicated east and west, while prevailing winds and seasonal weather patterns helped define when travel was safest. Ocean swells could preserve direction over long distances, even when local winds changed. A skilled navigator could feel several overlapping wave patterns through the motion of the hull and recognize which one came from a persistent source. Clouds also carried information. Their shape, height, colour, or stationary position could reveal land below the horizon. Lagoons sometimes cast a pale reflection beneath clouds, while forested islands produced darker tones. Birds were equally valuable. Some species fed far out at sea but returned to land near sunset. Their morning and evening flight paths could point toward islands invisible from the canoe. Floating branches, leaves, seeds, insects, and changes in marine life might all suggest that land was near. None of these clues guaranteed success. Stars disappeared behind clouds. Storms confused wave patterns. Birds could lead sailors towards small rocks without fresh water. Winds shifted, currents strengthened, and an island only a few dozen kilometers away could remain unseen beyond the curve of the horizon. Navigation was not magical certainty. It was the disciplined reduction of uncertainty, built from experience and sharpened by repeated voyages. Exploration may have involved deliberate searches and widening arcs. Crews could sail outward for a limited number of days, then turn back while water and food remained. A favourable wind used for departure was useful only if sailors understood how they might return against it, or wait for a seasonal change. Some voyages probably failed. Canoes disappeared, crews died, and discoveries were forgotten because no one returned to describe them. The archaeological record preserves successful settlement far more clearly than unsuccessful exploration, creating a misleading impression that expansion was smooth. Once land was located, finding it again presented another challenge. Navigators had to convert the experience into a route that others could remember. Directions were likely preserved through sequences of stars, swell patterns, winds, bird behavior, and estimated travel time. Such knowledge may have been taught through repeated journeys and verbal instruction. Later, Pacific navigational traditions demonstrate how entire mental maps can be carried without writing. With islands understood as relationships within moving seas rather than fixed points on paper, a colonizing voyage required more cargo than an exploratory one. Fresh water was essential and difficult to store securely. Food had to survive heat, salt spray, and several days at sea. Root crops could be carried as planting stock, while coconuts provided both liquid and nourishment. Tools for clearing vegetation, making shelters, fishing, and repairing canoes had to remain accessible. Fire might be transported as embers or recreated after landing. Pigs, dogs, and chickens were carried. Added noise, weight, and demands for water. The passengers mattered as much as the cargo. A permanent settlement could not be founded by a handful of sailors alone. Successful communities required people of different ages and skills, including those who knew gardening, fishing, childbirth, healing, construction, food preservation, and the management of introduced animals. The voyage was therefore a transfer of society, not simply a journey of discovery. Kin groups may have travelled together, reducing the isolation of the first years and preserving shared obligations after arrival. The boats were carrying an entire future in fragile form: a cracked water container, damaged sail, injured navigator, or sudden storm could destroy that future before land appeared. Yet the voyages continued. Their success rested not on fearlessness, but on preparation precise enough to make fear manageable. Long before a canoe touched an unknown beach, the crossing had already been built into its hull, woven into its sail, stored in its cargo, and remembered in the minds of those watching the stars. Long after the canoes vanished, the faces remained. They stare out from fragments of clay with eyes formed by tiny stamped impressions. Their features came pressed into bands of angles, arcs, and repeated teeth. Some are immediately recognizable as faces. Others seem to hover between human, animal, and pure geometry. A curve may suggest a brow, a pair of circles may become eyes, and a narrow line may form a nose only after the viewer has looked at it for several seconds. The designs are among the most distinctive creations of the Lapita world. Yet their meanings disappeared with the people who understood how to read them. The technique begins with a tool rather than a brush. Potters cut small teeth into the edge of wood, bone, shell, or another firm material. While the clay remains soft, the tool is pressed into the surface again and again, leaving rows of tiny impressions. Different tools create different widths and rhythms. Straight stamps produce borders and grids. Curved tools help form spirals, circles, and sweeping bands. By rotating, overlapping, and carefully aligning these impressions, a skilled potter can build a design of remarkable complexity. There is little room for carelessness. A misplaced stamp cannot simply be erased. The pattern must follow the curve of the vessel, keeping its proportions as the surface narrows toward the base or expands around the shoulder. The potter must plan ahead, imagining how separate bands will meet after circling the entire pot. The most elaborate vessels reveal not casual decoration, but disciplined visual thinking. Before decoration begins, the clay itself must be understood. On volcanic islands, suitable clay may occur near streams, exposed banks, or weathered inland deposits. It must be cleaned of roots and coarse particles, then mixed with temper such as sand, crushed shell, or fragments of older pottery. Too little temper and the vessel may crack while drying. Too much, and its walls may become weak. The clay is shaped without a fast potter's wheel, probably through coiling, paddling, pressing, and careful smoothing. Each stage depends on knowledge gained through practice and passed from one maker to another. The finished pots varied in size and form. Some were open bowls, others were deep containers with rounded bodies, flaring rims, or stands. Many vessels remained undecorated and were probably used for ordinary cooking and storage. The famous dentate stamped examples form only part of the ceramic record, which is one reason their purpose remains uncertain. The time required to make them suggests they were not treated like simple cooking pots. Some may have held food during ceremonial gatherings. Others may have contained water, fermented drinks, gifts, or substances used in rituals. Their designs may have transformed the vessel into something resembling a body. A rounded pot has a mouth, neck, shoulder, and belly, terms still used to describe ceramic forms. When a stylized face appears beneath the rim, the resemblance becomes stronger. The vessel seems to look outward while people gather around it. It may have represented an ancestor, a spirit, a clan, or a living person. Scholars still debate these possibilities because no surviving inscription identifies the figures. Later Pacific art provides tempting comparisons. Mask-like faces, repeated eyes, curved noses, and geometric bodies appear in carvings, suskas, bark cloth, tattooing, architecture, and ceremonial objects across many island societies. Some researchers see distant continuity between these traditions and Lapita pottery. Others warn that similar visual forms can emerge independently, and that thousands of years separate the earliest ceramics from many better recorded examples. What survives in the record suggests connections, but it does not allow every later symbol to be projected backward with confidence. The faces may also have expressed identity in a more immediate way. Lapita communities were moving into new islands while maintaining relationships with distant settlements. In such a world, decoration could help distinguish families, villages, or regions. A pattern might reveal where a pot was made or who had the right to display it. It could preserve membership in a wider network, even after a household had travelled far from its ancestral shore. Not every decorated pot travelled. Studies of clay composition suggest that many vessels were produced locally rather than transported across vast distances. This makes the similarity of their designs even more significant. People were carrying knowledge, tools, or remembered patterns rather than merely exchanging finished containers. A potter on a newly settled island could reproduce a visual tradition learned elsewhere, adapting it to local clay and personal technique. Small changes accumulated across the ocean. Some island groups favoured certain motifs, others simplified the designs or arranged them differently. Even when the general style remained recognisable, no two communities were exact copies. The pattern behaved like language shared enough to connect distant speakers, flexible enough to develop local accents. The creation of a face may have taken hours, yet the vessel could break in an instant. Some fragments found at archaeological sites are heavily worn, suggesting long use. Others appear to have been broken while relatively fresh. Pots may have shattered accidentally during cooking, transport, or daily handling. In some cases, deliberate breaking is possible, especially if vessels were involved in funerals or ceremonies, though the evidence remains incomplete. A broken pot might mark the end of an event rather than the failure of an object. Once discarded, fragments entered layers of ash, shell, food waste, and soil. Their durability preserved information that nearly every other decorated material lost. Lapita artists almost certainly worked in wood, fibre, leaves, skin, feathers, and bark, but tropical decay erased most of that visual world. The surviving pottery may therefore offer only a narrow glimpse of a much richer artistic tradition. The stamped faces could have echoed designs once painted on sails, woven into mats, carved on canoe prows, or marked on human bodies. This possibility makes the fragments more haunting. They are not necessarily the greatest works the Lapita people created. They are simply the works that endured. Across thousands of islands, the ocean destroyed canoes, houses, and countless objects bearing memory. Clay survived because fire had altered it permanently. Every stamped impression preserved the pressure of a maker's hand, a small physical act repeated more than 3,000 years ago. The meanings are silent, but the intention remains clear. These people wanted the surface to speak. The faces do not tell modern observers exactly who the Lapita were. Instead, they reveal that the makers saw themselves as part of a world of symbols shared across enormous distances. Each vessel belonged to a local household, yet its patterns pointed beyond the beach where it was made. The same eyes appear on distant shores, watching over communities joined by routes no map recorded. In the absence of writing, clay became a form of memory, and its broken faces became the most enduring witnesses to a culture moving eastward across the Pacific. The first settlements beyond the old western islands were built where land and sea almost touched. Lapita communities favoured coastlines shaped by lagoons, reef passages, river mouths, sheltered bays, and narrow beaches where canoes could be drawn ashore without fighting heavy surf. These were practical choices, but they were also cultural ones. The sea was not simply beside the village. It entered the village's daily rhythm, supplying food, carrying visitors, defining routes, and preserving the connection between newly settled islands and the communities left behind. Many sites were established on small offshore islands or coastal flats rather than deep inland. In some places, houses may have stood on posts over shallow water or tidal ground. Wooden platforms would have kept living spaces above damp soil. Insects and minor flooding while allowing canoes to approach closely. Archaeologists rarely recover complete house plans because timber decays quickly in tropical conditions. But post holes, compacted surfaces, hearths, and concentrations of refuse reveal traces of structures once raised above busy shorelines. A Lapita village was probably not a tightly packed town. It may have consisted of several related households spread along a beach or around a lagoon, each with cooking areas, storage places, working spaces, and access to gardens farther inland. Roofs were likely thatched with palm leaves or other plant materials. Walls may have been woven from reeds, bamboo, or split timber. Floors could be covered with mats, all of which vanished long before archaeologists arrived. What remains is mostly what people dropped, broke, burned, ate, or buried. The refuse is unusually informative. Shell middens contain the remains of meals collected over years: clams, oysters, limpets, sea snails, crabs, and other reef creatures. Fish bones reveal the use of lagoons, reefs, and deeper offshore waters. The presence of large pelagic fish suggests that some crews ventured beyond protected bays with specialized hooks, lines, or nets. Turtle bones occur at certain sites, as do remains of seabirds and fruit bats. These communities did not depend on a single food source. They learned to combine marine abundance with cultivated plants and introduced animals. The reefs surrounding many islands acted as natural food stores, but they required detailed knowledge. Tides exposed shellfish beds for only limited periods. Certain fish entered lagoons during particular seasons or moon phases. Dangerous currents could form near reef openings. Some creatures were poisonous at certain times of the year. The earlier settlers had to learn these patterns, and mistakes could be costly. Knowledge gathered during exploration became more precise with every season of permanent residence. Fishing technology was adapted to different environments. Shellfish hooks could be shaped, drilled, and polished into forms suited to particular species. Nets and lines, although rarely preserved, were almost certainly essential. Spears, traps, and woven baskets may have been used in shallow water. At night, people could exploit reef flats by torchlight, collecting creatures concealed during the day. The sea provided food with a regularity that gardens could not always guarantee. Especially during the vulnerable first months after settlement, gardens were nevertheless crucial. Forest had to be cleared, soil tested, and planting material protected from salt spray and drought. Taro, yam, banana, breadfruit, coconut, and other useful plants were carried eastward in different combinations. Not all crops thrived on every island. High volcanic islands offered fertile soils and freshwater streams, while low coral islands presented thinner ground and greater exposure to storms. Settlers adjusted their choices to local conditions, sometimes depending heavily on imported plants and sometimes drawing more extensively on native species. Domestic animals also altered village life. Pigs could provide meat and social value, but they competed with humans for food and damaged gardens unless controlled. Chickens were easier to transport and reproduce, though their archaeological remains are sometimes difficult to identify. Dogs may have served as companions, hunting animals, or food. Rats almost certainly travelled aboard canoes, whether deliberately or accidentally, once ashore. They spread rapidly through ecosystems that had never encountered such predators. The environmental consequences began almost immediately. Birds nesting on the ground had little defence against people, dogs, pigs, or rats. Some species disappeared soon after human settlement, though exact dates remain difficult to establish. Forests were burned to create gardens, encouraging erosion on steep slopes. Shellfish beds near villages could be depleted, forcing collectors to travel farther. What initially appeared to be an untouched paradise was not an unlimited one. Still, the settlements were not merely camps of survival. Their inhabitants created social landscapes. Hearths became centres of daily life. Food was shared, pottery exchanged, ornaments made, and children raised within sight of the ocean. Canoes under construction lay near houses. Fishing gear dried in the sun. Smoke from cooking fires drifted above roofs while people repaired tools, processed crops, and prepared for voyages. The rhythm was domestic, but always connected to the wider sea. Burial places, ceremonial areas, and special deposits suggest that some locations carried meanings beyond ordinary occupation. A lagoon might be linked to ancestral arrival. A reef passage could become remembered as the place where the first canoe entered. Certain trees, springs, stones, or headlands may have been treated as markers of identity. The evidence remains incomplete because beliefs leave fewer traces than pottery or bone, yet permanent settlement requires more than obtaining food. People must turn unfamiliar terrain into a place where memory can take root. Contact with other islands remained essential. A village that relied only on its immediate surroundings risked isolation after storms, crop failure, or conflict. Canoes carried spouses, stone, shell valuables, planting material, and news between communities. Some settlements may have served as stopping points along longer routes, offering water and shelter to travellers. Others occupied strategic locations near passages through reefs, allowing inhabitants to control access or facilitate exchange. The shoreline itself was unstable. Cyclones destroyed houses, salt water damaged gardens, and waves eroded burial grounds. Volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, and tsunamis were constant possibilities in parts of the Southwest Pacific. Villages could be abandoned and rebuilt nearby. A protected bay might gradually fill with sediment, while a storm could open a new channel through a reef. The people who lived there learned that permanence did not mean stillness. This mobility complicates archaeology. A single community may have shifted its houses several times while remaining within the same landscape. Later erosion can scatter pottery across beaches or carry it offshore. Sites now located inland may once have stood beside water because coastlines have risen, fallen, or advanced. The pattern of settlement must be reconstructed from a geography that no longer exists exactly as it did. Yet the surviving evidence consistently points toward communities positioned between two worlds. Inland gardens gave them roots, while the sea kept them connected. Their houses faced lagoons not because they feared the interior, but because the horizon was part of their social world. Every arriving sail could bring relatives, goods, warnings, or stories from another island. Every departing canoe carried part of the village outward. In these settlements, the Great Pacific Expansion stopped being an expedition and became ordinary life. Children born on remote islands grew up knowing no Western homeland except through inherited memory. Beaches once reached by cautious explorers became familiar places marked by hearths, graves, gardens, and paths. The sea remained dangerous, but it was no longer empty. It was filled with destinations, and each village helped turn a chain of distant islands into a connected human world. The villages may have stood on separate islands, but they were not separate worlds. Beneath the apparent isolation of the Pacific lay a web of movement so persistent that objects made in one place repeatedly appear far from their source. A piece of volcanic glass from New Britain reaches islands hundreds of kilometers away. A shell ornament shaped on one reef turns up in a settlement across open sea. Stone suitable for adzes moves along routes that connect communities divided by channels. Storms and weeks of travel, the ocean does not erase contact, so it carries it. Obsidian provides one of the clearest clues. This dark volcanic glass fractures into edges sharp enough to cut flesh, wood, fibre, and food. It is useful, portable, and chemically distinctive. Different volcanic sources contain slightly different combinations of elements, allowing researchers to identify where a fragment originated even after it has been transported far from the quarry. When obsidian from the Bismarck archipelago appears in distant Lapita settlements, it reveals more than a single voyage. It shows that people maintained routes back toward the west after establishing homes in remote Oceania. Some pieces travelled astonishing distances. They passed from island to island, perhaps exchanged many times before reaching their final destination. A small flake may have begun as part of a larger core carried aboard a canoe. At one village, pieces were removed for tools. The remaining stone continued eastward as a gift, payment, or item of prestige. By the time it was discarded, no one holding it may have known the person who first quarried it. Yet the material still connected them to a volcanic landscape far beyond the horizon. Not every exchanged object was strictly necessary. Many islands had local stone capable of performing ordinary tasks. Shell was widely available. Clay could often be found nearby. The continued movement of non-essential objects suggests that exchange served social purposes as much as practical ones. A tool made from distant stone could demonstrate access to voyaging networks. An ornament from another archipelago might carry the memory of a marriage or alliance. A decorated vessel could arrive with visitors and remain in a household as evidence of a relationship. The value of an object often came from its journey. A shell bracelet made locally was useful and attractive, but one known to have crossed several islands possessed a history. Its material could evoke a place of origin, a famous reef, or relatives living far away. Objects moved with stories attached, though the stories have not survived in the ground. Archaeologists recover the shell and stone, but not the names of the people who passed them from hand to hand. Exchange also reduced the dangers of colonization. A newly settled island could lose crops to drought, saltwater flooding, insects, or careless burning. A cyclone might destroy houses and canoe sheds in a single night. Pigs could die, chickens disappear, and planting stock rot before it was established. Contact with other communities provided insurance. Canoes could bring fresh tubers, cuttings, animals, tools, and skilled people. A family facing shortage might call upon relatives elsewhere. Social connections became a form of stored wealth, more flexible than any granary. Marriage was likely one of the strongest links between islands. Small settlements needed new partners to avoid becoming closed and fragile. A spouse arriving from another community brought language, techniques, obligations, and knowledge of distant roots. Children born from these unions belonged to more than one place. Their relatives formed a network of potential refuge and support. The archaeological evidence cannot identify most marriages, but the genetic mixture and shared cultural practices visible across the region suggest that people moved alongside objects. Voyages probably followed rhythms shaped by seasons. Certain winds favoured travel in one direction, while later shifts made return possible. Communities may have timed gatherings, exchanges, and marriages around predictable periods of calmer weather. A canoe arriving after weeks away brought more than cargo. It carried reports of storms, deaths, successful harvests, disputes, and discoveries. News travelled at the speed of sail. But across the Lapita world it travelled far enough to keep distant communities aware of one another. Some settlements may have become important hubs. A village near a safe reef passage or reliable freshwater source could receive crews moving between larger islands. Its inhabitants might host travellers, repair canoes, redistribute goods, and arrange onward journeys. Such places would accumulate objects from several regions and develop wider social influence. Other settlements may have remained more local, connected mainly to one or two neighbouring islands. The exchange network was probably uneven, with busy routes, quieter branches, and occasional breaks caused by conflict or disaster. The pottery record reflects this complexity. In some cases, clay analysis shows that vessels were made from local materials even when their designs resembled those of distant communities. In other cases, finished pots appear to have travelled. This means ideas often moved more widely than objects. A visiting potter could teach a technique. A married woman or man might reproduce familiar patterns in a new settlement. A small decorated fragment could serve as a model. Shared style did not require constant shipment of heavy pottery across the ocean. It required continuing contact between people who recognized the same visual traditions. Knowledge itself was probably the most valuable thing exchanged. Sailors shared information about currents, shoals, anchorages, and islands not yet permanently occupied. Gardeners learned which crops tolerated particular soils. Fishers passed on the locations of reefs and seasonal spawning grounds. Boat builders compared timber, lashings, and sail forms. Healers encountered unfamiliar plants. Each voyage enlarged a collective map that existed only in memory and practice. This map was not equally available to everyone. Certain navigators, lineages, or communities may have guarded parts of it. Control over routes could create status. A person who knew how to reach a valuable obsidian source or a distant island with marriage partners possessed power that could not be measured in stored goods alone. The ability to connect places was itself a resource. Scholars still debate whether these networks were centrally organized or maintained through countless local relationships. The evidence favors no single authority directing movement across the entire Lapita world. There was no known capital, fleet command, or imperial system. Instead, contact seems to have grown from overlapping ties between households and communities. The network endured because many people had reasons to keep it alive. Over time, some connections weakened. As settlements became more self-sufficient, the need for certain imports declined. New local identities emerged. Long distances made regular contact difficult, and storms or conflict could sever routes for generations. Yet during the height of the Lapita expansion, exchanged objects show that migration did not end when land was found. The settlers remained part of a larger maritime society. A fragment of obsidian buried on a remote island therefore marks more than trade. It records trust, obligation, navigation, and memory. Someone carried it through dangerous water because another community expected its arrival or valued what it represented. Across thousands of kilometers, the Lapita world held together not through roads or written messages, but through repeated departures and returns. Every successful voyage tightened the network, turning scattered islands into parts of a shared human geography. Every eastward voyage carried more than passengers. Beneath mats, beside water containers, and within the sheltered spaces of the canoe travelled pieces of an entire living system. Tubers were wrapped to keep them moist. Coconuts were stored for both food and planting. Young shoots, seeds, cuttings, and carefully chosen roots crossed the sea alongside pigs, chickens, dogs, and the unwanted rats hidden among cargo. The Lapita expansion was therefore not only a movement of people, it was the movement of an ecology. For settlers arriving on an uninhabited island, the first problem was not discovery but continuity. A green landscape could appear abundant while offering little that was familiar or dependable. Native forests contained edible fruits, birds, shellfish, and useful timber. But a permanent village needed foods that could be produced repeatedly near home. Hunting and gathering alone might support small groups for a time, especially where wildlife had never learned to fear humans. Yet those resources could decline quickly. Gardens turned a temporary landing into a settlement. The most important crops were transported not as sacks of grain but as living material: taro, yam, banana, breadfruit, coconut, and other plants required different methods of propagation. Some survived as cuttings, others travelled as tubers or young plants. Salt spray, heat, rough handling, and delays at sea could destroy them before arrival. A voyage might reach land safely and still fail if the planting stock had rotted. For this reason, colonizing canoes probably carried more than one variety and more than the minimum needed. The first gardens were acts of calculation. Settlers had to identify soils that held moisture without becoming waterlogged, clear vegetation without losing control of fire, and plant at the correct point in the seasonal cycle. On volcanic islands, dark fertile ground could support productive crops, but steep slopes eroded easily after clearing. On low coral islands, soils were thin and freshwater scarce. Plants that thrived in one archipelago might struggle in another. Early communities learned through trial, observation, and sometimes costly failure. Taro demanded water and careful tending. Yams required suitable soil and support. Bananas could grow rapidly but were vulnerable to storms. Coconuts tolerated coastal conditions and provided liquid, flesh, fibre, leaves, and timber. Yet a newly planted palm took years to mature. Breadfruit eventually became a major staple in many Pacific societies, though its spread and early importance varied by region. No single crop guaranteed survival. Stability came from diversity. Domestic animals added another layer of possibility and risk. Pigs converted scraps and plant foods into meat, reproduced in settlement, and may have acquired ceremonial importance. They were also difficult passengers. A pig aboard a crowded canoe consumed water, created waste, and could injure people or damage cargo. Once released on an island, pigs rooted through gardens and disturbed native vegetation. Keeping them required fences, tethering, or constant supervision. Chickens were smaller and easier to carry. Their eggs and meat offered a renewable resource, though they too needed protection and food. Dogs may have assisted with hunting, guarded settlements, or served as companions, and in some Pacific traditions they were also eaten. Their exact roles in early Lapita communities remain uncertain, but their transport shows that settlers were recreating familiar social and economic relationships rather than relying entirely on the new environment. Rats came with fewer benefits. The Pacific rat could slip aboard canoes in baskets, food stores, or bundles of thatch. Whether people sometimes transported it intentionally remains debated, but once introduced, it spread through island forests with remarkable speed. Native birds, reptiles, insects, and plants had evolved without such a predator. Eggs laid on the ground or in low nests became easy prey. Seeds were consumed before they could germinate. Entire ecological relationships began to change before settlers could have understood the long-term consequences. Human hunting accelerated the transformation. Many remote islands supported large, flightless, or weak-flying birds. Having never encountered people, these animals often showed little fear. They could be captured with extraordinary ease. Turtles came ashore to nest. Seabird colonies offered eggs and meat in dense concentrations. Giant land birds survived on some islands until shortly after human arrival. Their disappearance was not always immediate, and climate or habitat change may also have contributed. But the broad pattern is clear: many species declined rapidly once people and introduced animals appeared. Fire left another lasting signature. Forest was burned to open gardens, improve access, encourage certain useful plants, and clear settlement space. Charcoal layers in sediments often increase around periods of human arrival. Repeated burning altered plant communities and exposed soils to heavy tropical rain. Sediment washed downhill into lagoons and reefs, changing coastal habitats. In some places, the environmental effects of settlement became visible within only a few generations. These transformations were not necessarily driven by carelessness. The first settlers could not have possessed complete knowledge of ecosystems that had never before included humans. A bird population might appear limitless until nesting grounds began to empty. A garden method successful on one island could cause erosion on another. Pigs that provided security during a food shortage could become destructive when their numbers increased. People adjusted as consequences became visible. But some losses could not be reversed. Archaeologists see this process in changing food remains. The earlier settlement layers often contain large bones, abundant shellfish, and species that later become rare or disappear entirely. Higher layers may show smaller fish, more intensive harvesting, or a greater reliance on cultivated foods and domestic animals. This shift suggests that the first generations exploited unusually rich wild resources, while later communities adapted to landscapes already altered by human presence. The newcomers also created new combinations of species. Plants originating in different parts of Asia, New Guinea, and island Southeast Asia began growing together on islands where none had previously existed. Pigs fed on introduced crops beneath native trees. Chickens scratched through gardens bordered by coconut palms. Rats entered forests while people harvested reefs. The result was neither the untouched island ecosystem nor a simple copy of the homeland. It was a new Pacific environment assembled through voyaging. Knowledge travelled with these species. A tuber was useful only if someone knew when to plant it, how to prepare it, and which parts could be poisonous when raw. Breadfruit required understanding of seasonality and preservation. Coconut fibre became cordage, leaves became roofing, shells became containers. Animal husbandry required inherited techniques. The canoe transported biological material, but culture made that material survivable. What survives in the record suggests that these transported worlds were never identical. Some islands received pigs but lost them later. Certain crops failed to establish or became important only centuries afterward. Communities selected different combinations according to environment, preference, and renewed contact. The Lapita package was flexible rather than fixed. Still, its consequences were immense. With every successful landing, humans carried familiar life into unfamiliar landscapes. Gardens replaced sections of forest. Domestic animals entered valleys and villages. Native species declined, while imported plants spread beyond cultivated plots. The people adapted to the islands, but the islands were also forced to adapt to the people. By the time children were born in these new settlements, the landscape around them was already different from the one their parents had first encountered. Paths crossed cleared ground, useful trees clustered near houses, pigs called from enclosures, smoke rose above gardens where forest had stood. The voyage eastward had ended, but another journey had begun, the slow transformation of remote islands into human homelands. The dead at Tiuma were buried close to the sea, beneath ground that later hardened into pale limestone and coral-rich soil. For more than 3,000 years, their remains lay hidden on the island of Efate in Vanuatu, undisturbed beneath a landscape transformed by time. When archaeologists uncovered the cemetery, they found something far more revealing than another cluster of pottery fragments. Here were the people themselves. Men and women who belonged to the first generation settling remote Oceania, their bones preserving evidence of travel, diet, ancestry, illness, ritual, and death. Tiuma is one of the earliest known Lapita cemeteries and one of the most important archaeological discoveries in the Pacific. Unlike ordinary village refuse, a burial ground preserves deliberate actions. Bodies are placed, arranged, revisited, and sometimes altered according to beliefs shared by the living. Every grave represents a sequence of choices. At Tiuma, those choices were complex enough to reveal a society in which death did not end a person's relationship with the community. The cemetery was positioned near an early settlement beside what was once a coastal lagoon. The landscape has changed since then, but the original location would have connected the burial place with water, canoe landings, and the routes by which the first settlers arrived. The dead were not hidden deep in the interior. They rested near the edge of the maritime world that had carried them eastward. Many of the burials were incomplete. Some bodies were placed in graves without heads. In other cases, skulls were found separated from the skeletons to which they originally belonged. Several crania had been arranged near or upon other burials. One grave contained multiple skulls placed across the chest of a deceased person. These were not signs of careless disturbance. The pattern suggests deliberate removal, retention, and later placement of human remains. The exact ceremonies remain unknown. Bodies may first have been buried intact, then reopened after the flesh decomposed. Skulls could be removed and kept for a period before being returned to the cemetery. They may have been displayed, carried, stored in houses, or used during rituals linking living families to the dead. Scholars still debate the sequence and meaning of these practices, but the evidence points to continuing interaction with ancestors rather than a single final funeral. The head often holds special importance in societies where identity, memory, and spiritual power are associated with the face. Lapita pottery itself repeatedly presents stylized eyes and mask-like features. It is tempting to connect these ceramic faces with the treatment of human skulls, perhaps seeing both as expressions of ancestor veneration. Yet the connection cannot be proven. Similar themes do not necessarily belong to one unified belief system, and no surviving oral account reaches securely back to Tiuma's earliest burials. What can be established is that death required labour. Graves had to be prepared in hard ground. Bodies were arranged according to practices understood by the community. Burials were reopened. Bones were removed and repositioned. Ceremonies likely involved food, objects, and gatherings of relatives. The dead remained socially active because the living continued to handle them. Decorated pottery appears in association with the cemetery, including vessel fragments that may have been used during funerary rituals. One especially striking object was a ceramic vessel placed upside down over a human skull. Whether it served as protection, a marker, an offering, or a symbolic replacement for something lost is uncertain. Its presence strengthens the impression that pottery carried meanings beyond storage and cooking. At tumor, clay, body, and memory were brought together. The cemetery also reveals the physical cost of life during the first settlement period. Some individuals show signs of injury, strain, or disease. Teeth preserve evidence of diet and age. Bones reflect repeated movement, physical labour, and the ordinary pressures of survival. These were not mythic navigators untouched by hardship. They were people who carried heavy loads, cleared land, paddled canoes, gathered shellfish, endured infection, and sometimes died far from the places where they were born. Chemical analysis of teeth provides one of the most intimate clues. The minerals incorporated into tooth enamel during childhood reflect the geology of the place where a person grew up. Because enamel does not significantly remodel later in life, it can preserve a kind of geological signature. At Tiuma, several individuals appear not to have spent their childhood on a fate. They came from elsewhere, possibly from other islands in Vanuatu or from regions farther west. This means the cemetery included migrants, not merely descendants of an established local population. Some of the dead may have crossed the ocean as adults. They had memories of different shorelines, different reefs, and perhaps different languages. Their children may have been born on a fate, growing up in a landscape their parents had known only after a dangerous voyage. The cemetery preserves both generations within the same social world. Those who arrived and those who began turning arrival into ancestry. Dietary evidence adds another layer. Early inhabitants consumed large quantities of marine food, including fish and shellfish, while also relying on cultivated plants and domestic animals. The balance varied among individuals. Some may have travelled frequently or spent more time exploiting offshore resources. Others may have depended more heavily on gardens. Food was not distributed in an identical way, suggesting differences in age, role, origin, or social position. Ancient DNA from early Pacific burials has complicated older assumptions about Lapita identity. Some of the earliest individuals in remote Oceania show strong genetic connections to populations ultimately linked with East Asia and Austronesian expansion, with relatively limited Papuan-related ancestry. In later generations, Papuan-related ancestry becomes much more prominent across many island populations. This suggests that migration and mixture occurred in stages rather than through one uniform movement. Tiuma therefore captures a moment before the full demographic history had unfolded. The people buried there belonged to an early frontier community, but even they were not necessarily identical in ancestry or origin. Some may have come directly from Western Islands. Others may have been born during intermediate stages of migration, intermarriage, adoption, and movement continued after settlement. The cemetery is not a portrait of a pure founding population. It is a snapshot of people already connected to several places. The treatment of their bodies may have helped hold that mobile society together. A skull carried from a grave into a house could preserve the presence of someone who had crossed the sea. Returning it later to the cemetery might bind a household to the new island. Ancestors born elsewhere could be transformed into ancestors of a fate through burial. The ritual made migrants part of the land. No single explanation fully accounts for every burial. Some missing skulls may have been removed through practices different from those represented by the skull deposits. Graves may have been disturbed at different times. Individuals may have held different statuses, and the cemetery itself may have changed in meaning over generations. Archaeology can reconstruct actions more confidently than beliefs. Still, the overall picture is extraordinary. At Tiuma, the Pacific expansion becomes personal. The vast migration is no longer measured only through kilometres, pottery styles, and radiocarbon dates. It is visible in teeth formed on distant islands, bones buried beside a new lagoon, and skulls handled by relatives who refused to treat death as separation. These people had crossed one of the great geographical thresholds in human history, but their deepest concerns remained familiar where the dead belonged, how memory should be preserved, and how a community could root itself in an unfamiliar place. The cemetery marks the point where a newly discovered island became more than a settlement. Once ancestors rested in its soil, it became a homeland. From the shores of Vanuatu, the movement continues with astonishing speed. Within only a few centuries, communities carrying Lapita traditions established settlements across an arc of islands stretching through New Caledonia, Fiji, Tonga, and Samoa. The distance is so great that, when viewed on a modern map, the expansion resembles a chain thrown across the ocean. Yet there is no evidence of a single organized fleet moving under one command. The pattern is created by repeated voyages, local decisions, new settlements, and further departures from islands that had themselves been reached only a generation or two earlier. This leap across Oceania is one of the fastest episodes of prehistoric human expansion. The earliest Lapita sites in the Bismarck archipelago date to roughly the middle of the second millennium before the Common Era. Not long afterward, related settlements appear thousands of kilometers farther east. Radiocarbon dates are continually refined, and scholars still debate the precise sequence of individual landfalls, but the broad pattern remains clear. People crossed the boundary into remote Oceania, and then moved through it at a pace that transformed nearly every major island group in the Southwest Pacific. The route was not a straight line. Voyagers followed archipelagos, explored side passages, revisited known islands, and sometimes bypassed land that would be settled later. The northern Solomon Islands offered stepping stones toward the open waters beyond, but even there, gaps between suitable islands demanded serious crossings. From the Santa Cruz region, sailors pushed toward Vanuatu, where high volcanic islands rose above the horizon and offered freshwater, fertile soil, timber, and reefs. Farther south lay New Caledonia, a long mountainous island surrounded by extensive lagoons. To the east, Fiji formed another large cluster of possible destinations. Beyond Fiji, Tonga and Samoa stood at the edge of an even wider ocean. Each archipelago presented a different test. Vanuatu consisted of many volcanic islands arranged in a long chain, allowing communities to spread north and south after the first successful arrival. New Caledonia offered large land areas but unfamiliar landscapes, including mineral-rich soils and distinctive ecosystems. Fiji contained hundreds of islands, from large mountainous interiors to small reef-bound coasts. Tonga was lower and more exposed, while Samoa combined high volcanic terrain with a position far beyond the familiar Western networks. Explorers could not know these details before arrival. They saw cloud banks, birds, and the faint outlines of land. Then entered reef passages where a mistake could destroy the canoe. A promising island might lack reliable water near the landing place. A protected bay could be surrounded by poor soil. A fertile valley might lie behind dangerous surf. The successful colonization of each archipelago therefore required more than locating land. Voyagers had to survey coastlines, identify resources, and decide whether to remain, return west, or continue searching. The first settlements often occupied beaches and lagoons that provided immediate access to marine food. From these footholds, people explored inland, tested crops, and discovered local materials. Some islands became bases for further voyages almost immediately. A child born in a newly founded village might grow up among adults who remembered another archipelago, then join an expedition toward an island no one in the community had ever seen. This generational relay helps explain the speed. The expansion did not depend on one navigator crossing the entire Pacific sector from the Bismarcks to Samoa. Knowledge and population moved in stages. A settlement in Vanuatu could support voyages toward Fiji. Fiji could become a departure point for Tonga. Tonga could provide crews, food, and navigational experience for journeys farther east. Every new community shortened the distance between the inhabited world and the unknown horizon. The network behind them remained important. Obsidian and other materials show that some connections stretched back toward Western sources. Although regular travel over the full distance may have become increasingly difficult, information probably moved through several communities rather than directly from one end of the Lapita world to the other. A story about a newly discovered island could pass westward through visiting crews, while planting materials and marriage partners moved eastward along the same chain. The migration was not necessarily continuous. Years or decades may have separated major discoveries. Some islands could have been visited repeatedly before permanent settlement began. Other attempts may have failed, leaving only small traces or none at all. Radiocarbon dates create broad windows rather than a complete voyage log. The apparent speed visible to archaeology may conceal periods of uncertainty, retreat, and experimentation. Even so, the achievement remains extraordinary. The settlers were moving through a world without established ports, stored supplies, rescue vessels, or guaranteed destinations. Every new island required the rebuilding of essential infrastructure from the beginning: houses, gardens, canoe sheds, fishing grounds, paths, and water sources had to be established before the settlement could support another wave of exploration. Expansion depended on successful domestic life as much as daring navigation. Population pressure may have encouraged movement, but it was probably not the only cause. Some communities may have sought new farmland or fishing grounds. Younger families could have viewed distant islands as opportunities to establish independent status. Disputes might push groups away. Marriage alliances, competition, curiosity, and the prestige of discovery may all have mattered. No single explanation fully accounts for why people repeatedly chose to leave islands that had only recently become home. The movement also carried consequences for those who remained. Departing families reduced labour and removed valuable skills. Canoes represented enormous investments that might never return. A failed voyage could erase an entire line of descendants. Communities therefore had to balance the promise of new land against the danger of losing people needed for gardens, fishing, defence, and ritual life. The fact that departures continued suggests that eastward movement became part of the culture's expectations, not merely an emergency response. Fiji appears to have been a particularly important crossroads. Its size, resources, and position allowed connections toward Vanuatu, New Caledonia, Tonga, and later other parts of the Pacific. Lapita pottery found there shares broad traditions with Western sites while developing local features. Communities were already becoming distinct, but they had not yet lost the visual and social links that identified them as participants in the same expanding world. Tonga marks another critical threshold. By the time Lapita settlers established villages there, they had reached the western edge of Polynesia. The islands were relatively small, yet they became centres of long-term population and cultural development. Archaeological evidence suggests that settlements spread through the Tongan archipelago rapidly, with communities occupying coastal locations and maintaining contact between islands. Samoa lay farther north and east, close enough to become part of this early movement but distant enough to test the limits of the existing system. Lapita-related pottery appears there, although the record is less abundant than in some western archipelagos. The evidence remains incomplete, partly because later volcanic activity, erosion, sediment, and coastal change have hidden or destroyed early sites. Still, Samoa's settlement establishes that these voyagers had penetrated deeply into the Pacific. By the end of the Great Lapita expansion, the inhabited world had widened by thousands of kilometres. Islands where no human voice had ever been heard now held villages, gardens, cemeteries, and canoe routes. The achievement was not marked by a final ceremony. No sailor could stand on Samoa and know that a major phase of human migration had reached its limit. From the beach, the horizon looked much as it had from every earlier island: open, inviting, and dangerous. Yet something changed there. After generations of rapid movement, the eastward advance slowed. Beyond Samoa and Tonga lay a far greater emptiness, containing island groups separated by distances that demanded new levels of endurance and navigation. The people had crossed one enormous oceanic frontier, but the widest part of the Pacific still waited beyond the sunrise. Then, almost as suddenly as the expansion begins, it seems to pause. By the time Lapita communities established themselves in Tonga and Samoa, the great eastward movement that had carried people across thousands of kilometres of ocean slows for centuries. Beyond western Polynesia lie the islands of central and eastern Polynesia, the Cook Islands, Society Islands, Marquesas, Tuamotus, Austral Islands, Hawaii, Easter Island, and New Zealand farther still. These places would one day be settled by descendants of the same broad voyaging tradition, but not yet. Between the first settlement of Tonga and Samoa and the later colonization of the wider Polynesian triangle lies a long interval that has puzzled archaeologists for decades. This interval is often called the long pause. Though the term can mislead if taken too literally, it does not mean that all voyaging ceased, or that society became stagnant. Communities in Tonga and Samoa continued to live, grow, adapt, and maintain some level of inter-island contact. What paused was the dramatic eastward expansion into the far central Pacific. For generations, people remained within Western Polynesia rather than pushing immediately onward into the even larger unknown. The mystery begins with geography. The islands east of Samoa and Tonga are not simply more of the same. They are farther apart, in some cases much farther, and the wind patterns become less forgiving. Sailing into Central East Polynesia would require longer voyages across open water with fewer obvious stepping stones. A canoe could no longer rely on the same rhythm of relatively close archipelagos that had supported movement through Vanuatu, Fiji, and Tonga. The next phase demanded a different scale of navigation. Wind direction may have been crucial. Much of the earlier expansion could make strategic use of prevailing winds and the arrangement of island chains. Farther east, voyagers increasingly faced the challenge of travelling into or across less favourable wind systems and then finding a way home. Exploration is one thing, repeated two-way settlement voyages are another. If return routes became too uncertain, communities may have hesitated to commit people and resources to such journeys. Canoe technology may also have played a role. The vessels used during the Lapita era were clearly capable of long-distance voyaging, but the greatest Polynesian voyages of the later period may have depended on refinements in hull design, sail rigging, cargo capacity, or navigational institutions that developed over time. The evidence is frustratingly indirect because wooden canoes rarely survive archaeologically. Still, some scholars argue that the long pause reflects a period during which societies in Western Polynesia were building the technological and social systems needed for even more demanding exploration. Population size matters as well. Early settlements in Tonga and Samoa may initially have been too small and vulnerable to spare large numbers of people for risky exploratory expeditions. Communities needed time to establish gardens, recover from environmental strain, and expand demographically. A few bad harvests, storms, or conflicts could wipe out the surplus required for ambitious voyages. The archaeological record suggests that the earliest generations were still engaged in the hard work of making these islands secure homes. Social priorities may have shifted. During the rapid expansion, new islands lay relatively close and accessible compared with what came later. Once Samoa and Tonga were settled, the nearest uninhabited lands may have offered too little immediate reward compared with the effort required to find them. It could have been more practical to deepen local settlement, build alliances, and intensify food production than to launch uncertain expeditions into a horizon that offered no guarantee of success. Environmental instability may also have discouraged further movement. Climatic fluctuations in the Pacific influenced storm frequency, rainfall, and sailing conditions. Even modest changes in El Niño and related systems can alter voyaging risks dramatically. Some researchers suggest that the period after initial settlement may have included less favourable conditions for safe long-distance eastward travel. The evidence for exact timing remains incomplete, but climate may help explain why the tempo of expansion was not constant. There is also a simpler possibility humans stop because they cannot yet see what lies beyond. The islands of East Polynesia are separated by immense oceanic spaces. Many are small, low, and difficult to locate. The fact that later navigators reached them does not mean earlier crews lacked courage. It may mean they lacked reliable knowledge that such islands existed. Exploratory voyagers could spend weeks at sea and return empty-handed, or fail to return at all, after enough losses. Communities might judge the cost too high. No single explanation fully accounts for the long pause, and scholars still debate how long it lasted, whether movement was truly absent in all directions, and how much contact continued between Tonga, Samoa, and neighbouring island groups. Archaeology is shaped by preservation. A handful of missed sites or poorly dated context can make centuries look emptier than they really were. Some undiscovered settlements may eventually narrow the apparent gap. Even so, the pause remains one of the central puzzles in Pacific prehistory. What makes it especially interesting is that it occurs after an astonishing demonstration of maritime capacity. The same cultural tradition that reached Samoa did not immediately proceed onward. This suggests that exploration is not simply a matter of technical ability. It depends on incentives, confidence, demography, environment, and accumulated knowledge. A society can be perfectly capable of voyaging far and still choose, for a time, not to, During these centuries, Western Polynesian communities were not waiting idly. They were becoming something new. Distinctive social structures developed. Local material culture changed. Pottery traditions altered and in some places disappeared. Oral traditions, kinship systems, political organization, and ritual life adapted to island conditions. The descendants of the Lapita settlers were no longer frontier colonists in the same sense as their ancestors. They were rooted populations shaping the cultural foundations from which later Polynesian societies would emerge. This may be the most important clue of all. The long pause was not a failure to continue the story. It was part of the story. It allowed the transformation of a rapidly expanding Lapita world into the more specifically Polynesian world that would eventually launch a second great age of voyaging. The settlers of Tonga and Samoa were not standing still at the edge of the Pacific. They were changing in ways that later made further expansion possible. When movement resumed, it would carry people into some of the most remote islands on Earth. But that later success depended on generations who remained where the first expansion had stopped, learning the winds, growing their numbers, reshaping their societies, and turning Western Polynesia into a durable centre rather than a temporary frontier. The ocean beyond still waited, vast and mostly unseen. For centuries its silence held. Then, much later, new voyagers would cross it. But before that could happen, the communities left by the Lapita expansion had to become more than settlers. They had to become ancestors. The pottery begins to change before it disappears. At first, the shift is subtle. The densely stamped faces and intricate geometric bands become less common. Designs simplify. Carefully arranged dentate patterns give way to broader incisions, plainer surfaces, and vessels made for ordinary use rather than display. In some regions, decorated pottery continues for generations. In others, it declines rapidly. Eventually, across much of Western Polynesia and parts of the wider Lapita world. Ceramic production fades so completely that later communities leave almost no pottery at all. This disappearance once encouraged dramatic interpretations. Perhaps the Lapita people had vanished. Perhaps invading populations replaced them. Perhaps a cultural collapse erased the tradition that had connected the islands. Yet the evidence does not support a simple extinction or sudden conquest. The people remained. Their settlements continued. Populations grew, and many other inherited practices survived. What disappeared was one highly visible material tradition, not the society itself. That distinction reveals one of archaeology's most persistent dangers. Cultures are often named after the objects that survive them, so when those objects change, it can appear that the people have changed just as completely. But a pottery style is not a population. A decorated vessel may vanish while language, kinship, navigation, gardening, ritual, and ancestry continue through altered forms. The end of Lapita pottery therefore marks as transformation, not a disappearance. Why the elaborate decoration faded remains uncertain. One possibility is that the social conditions which made it valuable no longer existed. During the period of rapid migration, shared designs may have helped distant communities recognize one another and preserve connections across newly settled islands. A decorated vessel could communicate participation in a wider maritime network, once settlements became established and local identities strengthened. That broad visual language may have lost importance. People no longer needed pottery to demonstrate that they belonged to a community stretching back toward distant Western homelands. The exchange networks themselves were also changing. Obsidian and other materials continued to move, but some long-distance routes weakened as islands became more self-sufficient. Journeys that had once been essential for obtaining crops, spouses, tools, and information may have become less frequent. A household whose closest alliances were now within its own archipelago had fewer reasons to maintain elaborate symbols recognized thousands of kilometers away. Decoration became simpler because the audience became more local. Producing dentate-stamped pottery required considerable labor. Clay had to be gathered, prepared, shaped, dried, decorated, and fired with care. If finely ornamented vessels were mainly used for ceremonies, feasts, or exchanges, their manufacture depended on social systems willing to support specialist knowledge and lengthy production. As those systems changed, simpler containers may have been more practical. Plain pottery could still cook food and store liquids without the time required to cover its surface in hundreds of precise impressions. In Western Polynesia, another development may have made pottery less necessary altogether. Communities had access to wooden bowls, gourds, coconut shells, baskets, leaf wrapping, and earth ovens. Many of these materials were abundant, lightweight, and easier to replace than fired clay. A wooden or fibre container was less likely to shatter during transport between islands. Food could be baked or steamed in underground ovens without ceramic cooking pots. The disappearance of pottery may therefore reflect adaptation to local resources rather than technological decline. This is important because societies are often judged unfairly when they abandon a material technology. Pottery seems permanent and complex, while baskets and wooden vessels appear simpler only because they decay before archaeologists can study them. In reality, weaving watertight containers, carving durable bowls, and constructing efficient earth ovens require sophisticated knowledge. The absence of ceramics does not mean that people forgot how to organize production or became less capable. They chose different solutions, many of which left almost no trace. Clay availability may also have influenced the pattern. Not every island possessed suitable deposits near settlement. Fuel for firing could be costly, especially where forest clearance had already changed the landscape. Salt carried by wind could damage exposed clay, and tropical rainfall complicated drying. On smaller islands, transporting heavy vessels between communities made little sense when containers could be made from local plants. Environmental constraints did not act alone, but they may have encouraged a transition already underway for social reasons. The fading of decoration was not uniform. In Fiji, pottery continued and developed into new local traditions. In parts of Melanesia, ceramic production remained important, though styles changed. Tonga and Samoa followed different paths, and even within single archipelagos the timing varied. This unevenness argues against one catastrophic event affecting the entire region. Instead, each community responded to its own resources, exchange relationships, population pressures, and cultural preferences. Scholars still debate whether some changes reflect the arrival of new groups or intensified interaction with neighbouring populations. Migration did not stop after the initial settlement wave. People continued crossing between Fiji, Tonga, Samoa, Vanuatu, and other islands. New influences entered established communities, while older traditions were reinterpreted. Yet there is little evidence for a complete replacement of Lapita descendants, genetic, linguistic, and archaeological records point toward continuity mixed with later movement. The last decorated vessels may not have seemed important to those who used them. No community necessarily gathered to announce that an ancient tradition was ending. A potter simply made fewer stamped pots. A daughter learned only the simpler patterns. A tool used to impress tiny teeth into clay was misplaced and never replaced. A ceremonial gathering adopted wooden bowls instead, within several generations. The knowledge that once produced mask-like faces across the Pacific may have narrowed to memory and then disappeared. The loss was greater than the disappearance of an artistic technique. When the design ceased, a visual system connecting distant islands became unreadable even to descendants of its creators. Meanings once carried by repeated eyes, curves, and geometric bands were no longer reproduced. Whatever stories, ancestral identities, or social privileges the patterns expressed faded with them. Later societies inherited the world those symbols had helped create, but not necessarily the ability to interpret them. Archaeologists encounter this transition as a thinning of evidence. Earlier layers contain decorated fragments that can be compared across islands. Later layers hold plain pottery or none at all. The past becomes more difficult to trace precisely because the most recognizable clue is gone. People continue building houses, cultivating land, traveling, marrying, feasting, and burying their dead. But their surviving objects no longer carry the same obvious signature. This makes the end of Lapita pottery strangely deceptive. The material culture seems to fall silent at the moment the societies themselves become more deeply rooted. The people have not vanished into the ocean. They have become harder to recognize because they no longer need to look the same. The fragments beneath the earliest villages preserve a period when connection had to be made visible. Later generations lived within worlds already connected by ancestry, language, and inherited roots. They could allow the old faces to disappear from clay because the oceanic society those faces once helped bind together had already become part of them. As the decorated pottery fades, the islands do not become culturally empty, they become more distinct. The shared Lapita foundation begins to divide into regional traditions shaped by distance, environment, population, and memory. Communities that once used similar vessels and maintained far-reaching exchange networks now develop increasingly different ways of building houses, preparing food, organizing authority, honoring ancestors, and relating to neighboring islands. The change is gradual enough that no generation experiences it as the breaking apart of one culture. Yet over centuries, the differences become profound. Geography encourages separation. Even the most skilled sailors cannot erase the cost of crossing open water. Voyages depend on weather, canoes, available crews, stored food, and social reasons strong enough to justify the danger. As communities grow more secure on their own islands, distant travel may become less necessary. A settlement that once depended on Western relatives for planting material or stone can eventually obtain most essentials locally. Connections remain, but they narrow. People visit nearby islands more often than distant ones, and regional networks begin replacing the old ocean-spanning system. Language changes with them. The Austronesian languages carried into remote Oceania do not remain identical. Pronunciation shifts, words acquire new meanings, and local innovations accumulate. Communities borrow vocabulary from neighbours and create terms for unfamiliar plants, winds, reefs, and social roles. A speech form once understood across several islands gradually divides into related but distinct languages. The process resembles the pottery patterns shared, origins remain visible. But local differences increase with every generation. In Western Polynesia, the languages that would eventually become Tongan, Samoan, and their relatives begin separating from those farther west. In Fiji and parts of Melanesia, linguistic histories become even more complex through sustained interaction with populations speaking older regional languages. No clear cultural boundary appears overnight. Instead, language reveals centuries of movement, mixture, and local development. The environment also pushes communities along different paths. A large volcanic island supports possibilities unavailable on a low coral island. Mountain valleys can hold extensive gardens, forests, freshwater streams, and populations living far from the coast. Small islands demand greater dependence on reefs, imported resources, and carefully managed land. Cyclones strike some regions more often than others. Drought, volcanic eruptions, soil fertility, and reef productivity influence how societies store food and organize labour. In Fiji, abundant land and varied environments support larger settlements and continuing ceramic traditions. Communities maintain links eastward toward Tonga and westward toward Vanuatu and New Caledonia, making the archipelago a zone of cultural exchange rather than an isolated endpoint. Pottery changes in form and decoration, reflecting local histories. Fortified settlements appear much later in some areas, suggesting periods of competition and conflict that reshape where people live. In Tonga, communities spread among relatively low islands with fertile soils and rich marine environments. Over time, ancestry and authority become increasingly tied to ranked social structures. The foundations of chiefly power emerge gradually, supported by control over land, food production, ceremonies, and inter-island relationships. Tonga would eventually develop one of the most influential political systems in the Pacific, but its distant roots lie in the communities established during and after the Lapita era. Samoa follows another path. Its large volcanic islands, productive valleys, and relative distance from Western centres encourage distinct forms of settlement and identity. Pottery becomes rare and eventually disappears, while technologies based on wood, stone, shell, and plant fibre continue developing. Villages remain connected by sea, but social relationships become rooted in local land, genealogy, and titles. These later institutions cannot simply be projected back onto the first settlers, yet they grow from societies descended in part from them. Farther west, Vanuatu and New Caledonia develop extraordinary linguistic and cultural diversity. Islands separated by short distances may contain communities speaking different languages and maintaining distinct traditions. This diversity does not mean people stopped moving. Paradoxically, frequent interaction can preserve difference when marriage rules, ritual practices, and local identities make boundaries socially important. Neighbours may exchange goods while deliberately emphasizing that they are not the same people. Conflict may have contributed to these divisions. Archaeological evidence for early warfare is uneven, and not every defensive site belongs to the period immediately after Lapita. Still, competition over land, reefs, valuable materials, and authority almost certainly occurred. Population growth increased pressure on productive areas. A cyclone or drought could transform neighbouring communities from exchange partners into rivals. Feuds might interrupt canoe routes, while alliances created new ones. Violence was only one force among many. Marriage repeatedly crossed the same boundaries that conflict created. A person could belong to one community by residence, another by ancestry, and several more through relatives. Exchange ceremonies allowed groups to compete while preserving contact. Shared rituals could unite neighbouring islands even when their languages and political interests differed. The developing cultures of the Pacific were not sealed units. They were identities created through relationships with others. Old Lapita practices survived in altered forms. Navigation remained essential. Horticultural knowledge continued through the cultivation of transported crops, shell ornaments, stone tools, earth ovens, and coastal settlement patterns retained deep histories. Ancestral connections remained central, although the rituals used to express them changed. The ancient visual language once stamped onto pottery may have migrated into materials that rarely survive tattooing: bark cloth, matting, wood carving, body decoration, and canoe ornament. This possibility cannot be demonstrated in every case. Scholars still debate how much continuity exists between Lapita designs and later Pacific art. Similar geometric patterns may reflect inheritance, reinvention, or both. The evidence remains incomplete because the most important later artistic materials decay quickly. Still, cultural knowledge does not vanish simply because its medium changes. A concept once represented on clay can survive as a pattern woven into fibre or marked onto skin. Over time, the memory of common origins may have become selective. Communities preserved genealogies linking them to founding ancestors, but those ancestors were increasingly associated with particular islands rather than the entire Lapita world. A landing place became sacred because one canoe arrived there. A mountain, reef passage, or grove became connected to a local ancestral story. The vast migration was transformed into many smaller histories of origin. This localization was essential. A society cannot remain permanently organized around departure. Settlers must eventually define who owns gardens, who can fish particular reefs, who inherits names, and who speaks for the dead. Land that once seemed open becomes divided among descendants. Genealogy turns geography into obligation. The island is no longer one destination within a chain of possible destinations. It becomes the center of the social universe. The shared tradition therefore does not collapse into confusion. It branches. Each island community chooses, adapts, forgets, and preserves. Some keep pottery, others abandon it. Some maintain long-distance exchange. Others turn inward for generations. Political systems grow more centralized in one place and remain dispersed in another. Languages multiply, rituals change, and different relationships with land and sea emerge. By the end of this transformation, no single culture stretches visibly from the Bismarcks to Samoa. In its place stand many societies, each with its own history, yet connected by traces buried beneath the surface. Their diversity is not evidence that the Lapita world failed to endure. It is evidence that it succeeded in creating permanent human life across environments so different that a single way of living could never remain unchanged. The ancient network survives not as uniformity, but as ancestry. Its roots become local seas, its settlers become founding figures, its shared symbols dissolve into regional traditions. One culture becomes many, and the Pacific begins to resemble the cultural world known in later centuries, divided by water, joined by voyaging, and filled with communities whose differences conceal a deeply connected past. The deeper researchers look into the Lapita past, the less it resembles a simple story of one people moving in a straight line across the ocean. Pottery once made the pattern appear almost orderly. A recognizable style emerges in the Bismarck archipelago, spreads eastward through remote Oceania, and then changes into regional traditions. But bones, languages, and genes preserve different kinds of history, and they do not always point in exactly the same direction. Human remains provide the most direct evidence because they belong to individuals rather than styles. A pot can be copied, exchanged, or carried far from where its maker was born. A skeleton cannot. Its teeth record childhood environments. Its bones reveal diet, activity, illness, and injury. Its DNA preserves fragments of ancestry inherited through generations. When these clues are compared with pottery and settlement dates, the Lapita expansion becomes more complex. Ancient DNA from some of the earliest known individuals in remote Oceania shows strong ancestry related to populations from East and Southeast Asia. In several cases, these early settlers carried surprisingly little Papuan-related ancestry, even though the Lapita tradition formed in a region where people of deep near-Oceanian ancestry had lived for tens of thousands of years. This suggests that at least some first colonizing groups moved east before extensive genetic mixture had taken place. Yet modern populations across Vanuatu, Fiji, Tonga, Samoa, and neighbouring islands often carry substantial Papuan-related ancestry. The contrast reveals that mixture increased after the first settlement wave. People continued moving east from near Oceania, marrying into established communities and reshaping the genetic landscape. In some regions, this happened within only a few generations. In others, the process appears more gradual. What survives in the record suggests repeated migration rather than one completed voyage. The details remain contested because the sample is small. Tropical heat and humidity destroy DNA quickly, and only a fraction of burials preserve enough material for study. Cemeteries may represent particular families rather than entire populations. New discoveries can therefore change the picture sharply, and scholars still debate the timing and meaning of the mixture. Genetics also cannot tell researchers what language a person spoke or how that person identified. An individual with mostly East Asian-related ancestry might have grown up in a community shaped by near-Oceanian knowledge. Someone with Papuan-related ancestry might speak an Austronesian language, use Lapita pottery, and belong fully to a newly established island society. Culture and biology travel together sometimes, but not always. Language preserves another map. Most languages spoken across remote Oceania belong to the Austronesian family, and many share vocabulary connected to seafaring, kinship, plants, animals, and domestic life. By comparing related words and sound changes, linguists reconstruct branches that point toward earlier movements. The distribution broadly supports an expansion from the west into the Pacific, but it also reveals long periods of contact, borrowing, and local innovation. Words for canoe parts, winds, crops, and social relationships can survive long after pottery styles disappear. Borrowed vocabulary can expose contact between communities whose archaeological remains appear distinct. However, linguistic family trees are not voyage logs. Languages can spread through trade, intermarriage, adoption, political influence, or population replacement. One community may abandon its ancestral language without losing most of its ancestry. Another may preserve an old language while absorbing many newcomers. The apparent branching of languages can also be blurred by centuries of contact between neighbouring islands. Archaeology adds material sequence but creates problems of its own. Researchers classify pottery, tools, ornaments, and settlement layers into types, then use those categories to trace relationships. These systems are essential, yet they can make gradual change look like sharp cultural boundaries. Two neighbouring communities may use different pottery while sharing spouses and rituals. Distant settlements may produce similar vessels even though contact between them is indirect. The conflict between evidence is not a failure. It is a sign that human history rarely follows a single track. The Lapita world consisted of people whose identities were formed through ancestry, residence, marriage, language, exchange, and shared practice. Different records preserve different parts of that process. Pottery remembers technique. Language remembers communication. DNA remembers biological descent. Burials remember ritual and belonging. None is complete on its own. Popular accounts sometimes reduce the debate to two extreme models. In one, a unified Austronesian population rapidly replaces older island communities as it moves eastward. In the other, Lapita culture spreads mainly as an adopted style among local peoples with little migration. Neither model fully explains the evidence. Migration was real, and so was interaction. Some islands were uninhabited before Lapita settlers arrived, making colonization undeniable. But the culture that reached them had already formed through contact, and later communities continued mixing with people from the West. Fringe theories occasionally claim that Lapita voyagers came from lost continents or ancient global civilizations. Such ideas are unsupported by archaeology, genetics, or linguistics. The genuine story requires no vanished super-civilization. Its complexity is more impressive. Small communities used inherited maritime skill to cross enormous distances, then created new societies through repeated encounters. Even the term Lapita people must be used carefully. It is convenient, but it can imply a unity that may never have existed in the way modern readers imagine. The inhabitants of a village in New Britain, an early cemetery in Vanuatu, and a coastal settlement in Tonga may have shared objects and ancestry, while understanding themselves through local families and places. They did not need a single collective name to participate in the same historical movement. The competing evidence gradually produces a more human picture. The first settlers were not isolated pioneers frozen in one ancestral form. They were followed by others. They married across communities, changed languages, adopted techniques, and redefined who belonged. Some remembered Western origins, others rooted identity in newly settled islands. Within a few centuries, ancestry and culture had already become layered. The mystery is therefore not solved by choosing pottery over genes or language over bones. It is approached by allowing all of them to disagree. Their contradictions reveal movement continuing beneath apparent settlement. The Pacific was peopled not by one clean wave, but by overlapping journeys whose traces survive in different forms. Every island preserves a slightly different combination, and together they show that the Lapita legacy was never a single bloodline or artifact. It was a history of connection strong enough to survive constant change. The Lapita world no longer exists as it once did, yet its clues continue to cross the islands. They survive first in the ground-broken pottery beneath village gardens, shell ornaments beside ancient hearths, obsidian carried far beyond the volcanoes where it formed, and human remains whose teeth preserve the geology of distant childhoods. These objects reveal only fragments, but together they trace the outline of one of humanity's greatest migrations. Across thousands of kilometers, families turned uninhabited islands into permanent homes, carrying with them the biological and cultural foundations from which many later Pacific societies developed. The most obvious legacy is population. The first settlers of remote Oceania did not vanish when their pottery traditions faded. Their descendants remained in Vanuatu, New Caledonia, Fiji, Tonga, Samoa, and neighbouring archipelagos, mixing with later arrivals and becoming part of increasingly diverse communities. Ancient ancestry survives unevenly, reshaped by more than 3,000 years of migration, marriage, isolation, disease, conflict, and renewed contact. No living population is a perfect copy of the first Lapita settlers, but many carry portions of that deep history. Language preserves another inheritance. Austronesian languages now extend across an extraordinary geographical range, from Madagascar in the Western Indian Ocean to Easter Island in the Eastern Pacific. The languages of remote Oceania contain vocabulary, grammar, and sound patterns descended from speech carried by ancient voyagers. Individual words have changed, disappeared, or been borrowed, yet their relationships reveal an old history of movement, a term used for a canoe, sibling, coconut. Or wind may contain traces of journeys made long before anyone recorded Pacific history in writing. Navigation traditions also preserve elements of the Lapita achievement. Although direct lines of continuity are difficult to prove in every detail, later Pacific navigators learned to read stars, swells, winds, birds, clouds, and reflections on the horizon. They carried mental maps across enormous distances and maintained routes between islands invisible from one another. These systems developed over centuries and reached remarkable sophistication in Micronesia and Polynesia. They should not be treated as unchanged relics from the Lapita period, but they belong to a maritime tradition whose foundations were already strong when the first settlers entered remote Oceania. The same is true of canoes. Later double-hulled voyaging craft and outrigger vessels cannot simply be projected backward in exact form, yet they demonstrate what Pacific boat-building knowledge could become. The Lapita crossings would have been impossible without an earlier mastery of timber, lashings, sails, balance, and repair at sea. Every later generation of builders inherited a world in which the ocean had already been crossed, measured, and transformed into a field of possible routes. The plants carried in those early canoes remain woven into Pacific life. Taro, yam, banana, coconut, and breadfruit became more than food. They shaped seasons of labor, systems of landholding, ceremonial exchange, and ideas of abundance. Varieties were selected for particular soils, rainfall patterns, and cultural uses. In many communities, gardens became living records of ancestry because planting material passed between relatives and generations. A crop transported across the sea could preserve the memory of an origin island long after the route itself was forgotten. Animals left a more ambiguous legacy. Pigs, chickens, dogs, and rats changed island environments permanently. Some became sources of food, companionship, wealth, and ritual value. Others contributed to extinctions and ecological disruption. The disappearance of native birds, changes in forests, and pressure on reefs show that the Lapita expansion was not only a heroic story of exploration, it was also the beginning of human-driven environmental transformation across islands that had evolved in isolation for millions of years. This contradiction is essential. The voyagers were extraordinarily skilled, but they were not outside nature. They depended on fragile ecosystems and altered them through survival. They carried life while causing other forms of life to disappear. Their descendants inherited both the resilience of cultivated landscapes and the losses created during settlement. The same pattern would repeat throughout human history, wherever people entered unfamiliar environments. Artistic memory is harder to follow. The stamped faces of Lapita pottery disappeared, but geometric designs continued to flourish across the Pacific in tattooing, matting, bark cloth, carving, body ornament, and architecture. Scholars still debate how directly these later traditions descend from Lapita imagery. Too much time has passed, and too many perishable objects have vanished to draw simple lines. Yet the persistence of repeated patterns, balanced forms, ancestral faces, and decorated surfaces suggests that the desire to make identity visible never disappeared. Oral traditions may contain equally distant echoes. Pacific societies preserved accounts of founding canoes, ancestral homelands, dangerous voyages, siblings separated by the sea, and chiefs establishing new communities. Such stories cannot usually be matched directly to specific Lapita migrations. Oral histories change as they are retold, connecting ancient movement to later political and social needs. Still, they preserve a central truth that archaeology independently confirms. Islands were settled by voyagers, and arrival became the foundation of belonging. European explorers arriving in the Pacific thousands of years later often misunderstood what they encountered. They saw widely separated islands and assumed isolation. They underestimated the navigational abilities of the people living there and sometimes attributed settlement to accident, drift, or outsiders. Colonial scholarship occasionally searched for imagined lost races rather than accepting that Pacific Islanders' ancestors had crossed the ocean through their own skill. Archaeology helped overturn those assumptions, but it also brought new responsibilities. Lapita sites are not simply scientific resources. They are part of the heritage of living communities whose ancestors are being studied, human remains, especially to raise questions about excavation, storage, analysis, and return. Local knowledge can guide research, identify threatened sites, and challenge interpretations produced far from the islands themselves. The sites are increasingly vulnerable. Coastal erosion, rising seas, storms, development, mining, and looting can destroy layers that survived for millennia. Many early settlements lie close to shore because the first inhabitants depended on lagoons and reef passages. The same locations now expose them to accelerating environmental change. A single cyclone can wash away pottery, bones, and hearths before they are documented. New technologies continue to uncover details. Improved dating narrows the timing of migrations. Chemical analysis identifies the origins of stone and clay. Ancient DNA reveals unexpected patterns of ancestry. Isotopes trace childhood movement and diet. Underwater archaeology may eventually locate settlements drowned by coastal change. Each method adds evidence, but none restores the lost voices of the people themselves. That may be why Lapita remains so compelling. The culture is visible enough to follow, yet incomplete enough to resist final explanation. Its pottery connects islands but cannot tell us what the connections were called. Its graves reveal ritual but not belief. Its genes reveal ancestry but not identity. Its roots demonstrate extraordinary knowledge, while the exact methods of the earliest navigators remain beyond recovery. The clues survive because the Lapita people did not leave one monument. They left thousands of small traces distributed across an ocean. Their achievement exists in distance itself, in the space between volcanic glass and its source, between a buried person and the island where childhood teeth formed, between related words spoken on shores separated by weeks of sailing. The Pacific culture that left clues across thousands of islands did not disappear. It became too widespread and too transformed to remain one thing. It entered languages, bodies, gardens, roots, and memories. Its unity dissolved, but its consequences endured. Every later society built upon the human geography those early voyagers created, living on islands that had once existed beyond the edge of the inhabited world. The fragments rest quietly now, buried beneath beaches where waves continue to fold themselves onto the shore. Some lie below villages filled with voices descended from generations the potters could never have imagined. Others remain beneath forests, gardens, roads, or shallow lagoons, their stamped surfaces hidden from the sun. The people who made them lived in a world where every voyage carried uncertainty. An island might exist beyond the horizon, or there might be only more water. A canoe could return with news of fertile land, or it could vanish without explanation. Yet families continued to leave familiar shores, trusting knowledge held in stars, winds, swells, birds, and memory. Their settlements altered the islands, and the islands altered them. Forests became gardens, landing places became villages, strangers became ancestors. A shoreline first approached with fear eventually became the center of a family's universe. Children born there no longer understood themselves as visitors. The graves of their elders gave the soil a history, and repeated seasons gave the horizon familiar names. Across centuries, the old roots weakened, pottery faces disappeared, languages divided, one connected tradition became dozens, then hundreds of distinct communities. But the ocean never returned to the emptiness that existed before the first arrivals. It remained filled with remembered destinations. Perhaps that is the most enduring Lapita legacy, not a single object, people, or symbol, but the transformation of distance. What had once been an unknown expanse became a landscape of relationships. Islands became homes because people learned how to leave one home without losing the possibility of return. Tonight, the same stars rise above the Bismarck Archipelago, Vanuatu, Fiji, Tonga, and Samoa. The swells still move across distances no human eye can measure from the surface. Birds leave their islands in the morning and turn toward them again at dusk. The signs used by ancient navigators remain present, even where the knowledge needed to read them has faded. And beneath those stars, somewhere near the water, another fragment waits in the sand. Its vessel is gone. Its maker has no surviving name. Its pattern cannot be fully understood. Yet the tiny stamped marks still hold the pressure of a human hand. Placed there before the canoe routes became legends and before remote islands became ancient homelands, the ocean carried almost everything else away. The clue remained,